Last Sunday, as some of you know, I was invited to preach at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which is not a bad gig for a simple country parson like myself. But among other things, it was a wonderful opportunity to renew the special relationship between our two congregations. It's easy to miss, but just above the side entrance to the church as you come in down that cloister and into the building here, if you look up, you'll notice a plaque below some fragments of white marble. The marble is from the altar at St. Paul's that was bombed by the Nazis during World War II. Bethesda parishioners contributed to the fund to repair the damage, and in gratitude, the then dean of the cathedral gifted us with this tangible sign of appreciation and friendship. It was a privilege to stand in the pulpit at St. Paul's and share with them this piece of Bethesda's story, a reminder that even across a wide ocean, our faith and our histories are intertwined. But one of the things that strikes you as you enter that cathedral, and the last time I was there was when I was 6. It hadn't changed a whole lot, but still, what hits you is that it is absolutely immense. 87,000 square feet, to be precise. And that iconic dome reaches 365 feet up into the sky. When it came time for the sermon, I climbed up 12 steps to get into the massive pulpit, which I swear is larger than your average London flat. But the greatest challenge for preachers is that there is a 12-second echo. In other words, when the choir sings the last note of an anthem, it reverberates for 12 long seconds. And the same is true of the spoken word. So you have to speak rather slowly. But as we look at today's gospel, it's hard not to relate to those who stood gawking outside the great temple in Jerusalem. They were stunned by the sheer size and splendor of it all. Standing beneath that great dome at St. Paul's, I couldn't help but think about the power of sacred spaces to lift our eyes and our hearts to God. That is certainly the case for those of us privileged enough to worship here at Bethesda-by-the-Sea. It is stunning. And I'm sure for a bunch of awestruck fishermen who had never seen anything like the temple in their entire lives, the temple was a most powerful and sacred sight. And this temple was indeed built to impress. You'll recall that the original temple was built by King Solomon 1,000 years before Jesus was born. The vision for it was to highlight God's presence amid the people, to serve as the central place of worship, and to demonstrate God's glory for all the world to see. It was destroyed, this first temple, by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and then it was rebuilt about 70 years later when the Babylonian exile ended and the Jewish people returned. By the time King Herod the Great came to power, some 400 years later, the so-called Second Temple was in desperate need of repair. You think we have deferred maintenance issues around here. I can only imagine what it must have been like to serve on the temple's Buildings and Grounds Committee. But around 20 years before Jesus' birth, King Herod began a massive renovation and expansion project, partly to glorify God, but mostly to glorify himself and establish his power and authority through the splendor and magnificence of what is often called Herod's temple. When Jesus tells those staring up in awe at the temple's majesty that the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another, and that it will all be thrown down, it's easy to understand their bewilderment at his words. This was, after all, the greatest structure they had ever laid eyes on. Its permanence was implied by its size. Its imperishability was glimpsed through its splendor. So the great difference between those who built St. Paul's Cathedral, which was designed by the famed architect Christopher Wren and completed in 1710, it was after the Great London Fire, and the difference between that and Herod's temple project is that the former sought to evoke God's transcendence and majesty, while Herod sought to highlight his own power, his own dominance, his own wealth. One was built to the glory of God, the other to the glory of Herod. One was designed to inspire faithfulness, the other to inspire fear. One was a monument to God's love and grace, the other to a man's insecurity and small-mindedness. And so, in this rather apocalyptic passage from Luke's Gospel, Jesus warns of being led astray by flashes of worldly wealth and the allure of man-made glory. His words of coming catastrophes, wars and earthquakes and plagues are not signs to be read by doomsday cults, but rather they point to the impermanence of all that surrounds us. No matter how grand or powerful or seemingly indestructible human temples and human institutions will fade away. And this all just feels so relevant to our own day. Because the great sin of this age is the temptation to marvel in our own abilities. We may not build marble temples, but we all erect and then stand back to admire the monuments we build to ourselves, our resumes, our reputations, our investments, our social media profiles, all the things we daily stack up stone by stone by stone to prove our worth to ourselves and to others. The great sin is putting faith not in the God who created and redeemed us and loves us, but in our own achievements. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a good and holy thing to be proud of that which we have accomplished, but not at the expense of putting our faith and trust wholly in Jesus Christ. Because whatever we build up is not eternal. Whatever we achieve is not forever. It may seem that way if we amass enough or build thick enough walls. It certainly seemed that way to Herod, and it certainly seemed that way to anyone taking in the splendor of his rebuilt temple. But in the end, Herod's temple only lasted another 40 years. This dominating symbol of power was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. And we see once again that the seemingly eternal things of this world are merely fleeting, that what endures is not the temporal, but the divine. And those words of Jesus echo in our heads. As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. Which isn't meant to scare us, but to reorient us to what matters in this life, to reassess how we are engaging with the world around us, and to recenter our lives on God rather than on ourselves or on our achievements or on human institutions or on a particular world view. As followers of Jesus, we are called to put our faith not in the large stones that surround and astound us, but in Jesus Christ, the chief cornerstone and perfecter of our faith. So yes, the stones will fall, the echoes will fade, but the one whom the builders rejected, the one whose body, like the temple, would be destroyed, holds out for us hope rooted in resurrection glory. Because our faith, our very lives, are stories not of destruction, but of restoration and renewal. As people of the resurrection, we fix our eyes not on the crumbling walls of this age, but on the living stones of the one whose risen life always keeps us rooted, even as we lift up our eyes to behold the power and the glory of God.